Hello everybody, and welcome back to my card game tutorial series. In this video we're going to be working on creating card piles in our game. I'll be showing you multiple ways to do this in case in your game you would like your piles to be represented differently. This is necessary in case you ever want to stack enhancing cards onto a card on the field, if you want to put energy cards on your Pokemon cards, or whatever your card game may entail. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe. The first thing we want to do is create the variables we will need in order to show these cards, in order to represent these cards on the field. So the first thing we want to do is create the following variables. So I'm going to represent my cards on the field as tokens, and then when we preview the card, we will show those cards behind the card we played them on. So I want to create the variables for the tokens I will use to represent those cards. Now I want to allocate 60 different values for these. The first thing I want to initialize are the variables for the tokens I will use to represent these cards. Now I'm going to create 60 different variables in one array. I'm going to call the array tokens. And since it's in this for loop, I'm creating 60 different positions in the tokens array for the cards I'm dropping on the field. Now I want to keep track of how many tokens I've created, so I'm going to create a token counter. Then I want to allocate memory for the pile of cards itself, because the tokens I'm using will work specifically for Pokemon, and if you're creating your own game, you may not need these, or you may not want to represent this way. So this array is going to be just for the stack of cards. And again, the worst case scenario would be 60 cards. And I'm going to name this array pile. And then I also want a pile counter. And set that equal to 0. So let's create the sprites for the tokens. If you need the sprites for this project, you can find a link attainable by anybody on my Patreon, and I will put a link to that in the description below. So all you have to do is just click there. There's a link to a Google document where you can download these sprites. So if you haven't done that, I recommend you doing that before moving on. So I'm going to create a new group in my sprites, and I'm going to call that energy tokens. These are the sprites we will use as tokens. So the first one I'm going to name is SPR_colorless token. Now I want these to be 19 pixels by 19 pixels. So they will be pretty small. I'm going to justify them to the middle center and lock it. Now I chose 19 pixels because if we go to a card sprite, we have it has a width of 76. And what I want to do is print out 4 tokens along the width of the card. So I'm going to take that width, which is 76, and divide it by 4, and I'll get 19, which is why I chose 19 pixels by 19 pixels. So now let's add the rest of them. And the naming convention we're going to follow is SPR underscore, the name of the energy type, followed by token. So now what we want to do is create a condition in our object card that if we release it onto the field to do some sort of action. So we're going to go to our object card left released event, and we're going to add a new condition. So the first one we have is if the field is empty and the card in our hand is a Pokemon, do this action. For this one, what we're going to do is if the card is an energy card, do this action. So we want to create that script. The script will be called SCR underscore is underscore energy. And we're going to pass it a variable called cardNum. I'm going to set that equal to argument 0. And then if in our strings array if this corresponding card type is an energy, we know that the card is an energy card. So we will want to return true for that, and if it is not, return false. So what we did here is we took the card number, subtracted it by 1, so that when we're in our strings array, it begins at the beginning set of strings for this card number. We multiplied it by 10 because there's 10 different strings for each card, and then we added it by 1 because the card type is the second position in that string array. So now let's go back to our left released event. We're passing it the card number, and we use the self designator because we have a local variable in here also called card number, and we don't want to use that one. We want to use the one that's in the create event of this object. So now we need to determine where it is in the field. And we're going to create a local field variable called field position. And we're going to set that equal to whatever this script returns. And that script is called SCR underscore field underscore position. This script is going to be used to determine where our mouse is on the field. This script is going to be used to see what position we are currently hovering over on the field. Prior to this, we used this method, which is what we're going to do in the script we just called, except since we are going to have to reuse this, we can put it in a script so that we don't have to write this out every single time we want to use that method. So we're going to create the script. And we can practically copy and paste this part of this over, since we're going to use it. We don't need this condition, and we're going to dent that backwards. So, if my x and y variables are within these field coordinates, return that I position. And if it is not, return -1. We are returning -1 because -1 is not a field position. And I can use that value as a condition to look over the action this would normally do. For instance, the condition I would use is if field position is greater than -1, which means my cursor is over a field position, and if there is a field card in that position, do this action. So I'm using this condition because if this field card position equals no one, that means there's no object there. And in order to drop this card, a Pokemon has to be on the field. So that's why I need this condition. So if the conditions are met, what I want to do is with that field card, there is a pile array that we created in the beginning of the video, and there is a pile counter, I misspelt field here. Let's misspelt it again. Misspelt it again. And that is called pile count. We're going to increment that because we're going to add this card to that pile. And we're going to set that equal to the card number. Then we want to remove that card from our hand. And destroy the card we are dropping. Well, destroy the hand object that represents the card we're dropping. So, what we did prior to removing a card from our hand was we used this code here. Now, I don't want to copy and paste this over, so I'm going to put it in a script. So all I have to do is call that script anytime I want to remove a particular card from my hand. So I'm going to copy this over and paste it here. It's that simple. And that's all I need to do. So now let's test this. If our code is working properly, we should be able to take a card from our hand, set it on the field, and when we let go of our mouse button, that card will disappear. So let's try that out. So I'm going to drop this Squirtle onto the field, and I'm going to take an energy card, and I'm going to drop it on top of Squirtle. So I have an error that's saying I'm indexing a variable that is not an array in my left released event on line 39. So let's see what I did wrong. Player, field card, field position, pile, player, field card. That's what is incorrect. There should not be an underscore between field and card. So let's try that again. Now, one thing I want to do is make it to where I can test this and make sure that I can start with a hand to test what I'm trying to do. As you can see, I can't drop an energy card. So after this, we will tailor our deck so that we can start with the right hand to test what we're doing. So I'm going to drop this energy card onto Squirtle, and it disappeared and it is removed from my hand. Now I can't do that with any other type of card because of the condition to where it's only an energy card that can be dropped. So we also need to remove Charizard from our deck and replace it with Blastoise. So let's fix our deck now. That will be in our script deck 1 init script. So we're going to change these 4s back to 2s. And we're going to move some of these around so that we can start with the right hand. And what we want to do is the last 6 cards will be our prize cards. So we want that to be cards we won't use. So I know I won't be using these cards. So I'm going to set these to the bottom so that when my prize cards are drawn, they will use these cards. So I'll denote that here. And then the next 5 cards will be my hand. So I want to start with, let's say, Squirtle and Blastoise. So I'm going to take this because I should start with a stage 0 Pokemon. And then I'll also want to start with a Blastoise. And since I took a Squirtle card and moved it to the bottom of the deck, I need to remove it from here so I don't have an extra one. So I'll be putting Blastoise at the end. So these next 5 cards will be my hand, and I'll denote that here. Now, I don't want my deck to shuffle after it's been initialized in the player object to undo what we just did. So I'm going to remove this shuffle script. And now let's see how our game acts. So as you can see, I started off with a Blastoise and a Squirtle. And I wanted to start off with the Squirtle because it won't mulligan. And now I can test what we need to for these cards. And I'll start with all of my energy cards so that I can stack as many cards as I possibly can onto one Pokemon card. Another thing I want to do is get rid of this macro. That's an old one we're no longer using. And I want to take this macro and move it to our macros object. So that we can have them all in the same place. Now, since we are utilizing the pile in the field card object. What I want to do now is create tokens for each card in the pile. So I'm going to create a step event, and what I'm going to do is set my token count equal to 0. And then I'm going to create a for loop. So for I is equal to 0 and I is less than the pile counter, I++. Now, if the pile at I is equal to 102, my tokens array will be set to 102. If the pile is equal to 96, which is the double colorless, that's actually going to give that card 2 tokens of double colorless energy. And so I want to do this for each energy type. Now, the token count being set to 0 at the top will go through the pile constantly, and it will readjust the tokens throughout. I need to do this because there are events in the game that can remove a card from the card pile. So therefore the token counter will also need to be updated also. So that's why I want to put this in the step event, because it will be calculating this every step of the game. Now, since I've started putting cards in the pile and I've started creating tokens, let's draw those tokens. So for I is equal to, and I is less than 60, I++, if there is a value in that token array, go through the next few steps. If that value is equal to a water energy, we want the sprite it's going to draw be the sprite for the water token. Now, we want to do this for each token we have. Now that we have that, we want to draw the sprite. So, since I want to have 4 tokens being drawn across the card, I want to do it in groups of 4. So the first 4 will be drawn at one line. The next 4 will be drawn a line above that, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to show you this way of doing it, and then I'm going to show you how to do it with using just cards. Say you don't want to use tokens, and in your game you want to show the physical cards themselves. So I'll show you that after this. So we're going to want to draw the sprite. We're going to use draw sprite extension because it'll allow us to do more than just draw the sprite at a specific location. We're going to draw the sprite we just initialized. Its sub image will be -1. We want it to be at the X position of the card minus the card width. So we want it to be drawn at the very end of the card, and we have to divide it by 2 in order to do that. Then we want to add 9.5 pixels to that so that it will be drawn inside of the card instead of half on the card and half off of the card. Then we want to push it by 19 pixels for every token we have drawn. So since the token is 19 pixels wide, we can multiply it by I for every token we've drawn. And we want to do the same for the Y position. We're going to do it at the Y position. We're going to do it at the Y position of the card. We're going to add the height so that it will be drawn towards the bottom of the card. We're going to divide it by 2. We're going to minus 15 pixels instead of the 9.5 because of the desired position I want it to be, and I will not need to make the Y position a function of I since Y won't change. Now the next things that we'll ask for is scaling the image in the X direction. I don't want it to scale it, so I'm going to set it to 1. Scaling the position or scaling the image in the Y position, I don't want it to scale that either. I don't want it to rotate, so I'm going to set that equal to 0. I'm going to set the color, and as you can see, I'm going through the draw sprite extension example below. I want the color to be its true color, so I'm going to put C white, and I want the alpha to be 0.5. Now, the alpha will change the opacity of the image. So I want it to be on the card, but I also want you to see the card on the other side as well. So that's why I made the opacity, or the alpha, set to 0.5. Now, only about 20 of these sprites will fit into the card, given the size of the card. So I want to do this 5 different times. And we're going to do that in steps of 4. And we're going to change just the X and Y position in the draw sprite extension function call. This will be the same, except I is much greater. So what we want to do is subtract it by 4 to get it to start back at 0. And then we want to bump this up by another row so that it will be above the previous row. So we're going to do that for all of these. And we're going to subtract I in parentheses by the previous step to get it to begin back at 0. And then this, and then they will also need to be risen by another layer. So each one will have one more subtraction by 19 than the previous one. So now if we did this correctly, we should be able to see these tokens drawn on top of the card. So if I drop Squirtle, and I drop an energy card on top of him, we have an issue. It is drawing a token on each layer, as we can see, but it's moving it backwards. That's because these should be else-if statements. So that, because 1 would have been true in every single case. 4, or every value from 1 to 3 would be true in each one of these cases. Each value between 1 and 7 would be true for each one of these cases, which is why we needed to use else-if statements. So it will only be 0 through 3, only 4 through 7, only 8 through 11, and so on. So now let's retest that. So let's drop the energy card on the Squirtle. As you can see, we have a token drawn on the card now. Now if I drop this double colorless energy on the Squirtle, more has been drawn onto the card. So let's drop as many as we can. So I can keep dropping these cards. As you can see, the card is filling up. And I wanted the opacity to be 0.5 so that even if the card is completely covered, you can still determine what the card is under the tokens. So it will only draw 20, but we can put as many cards onto the pile as we can. So even though the cards we just dropped aren't being represented, they're still in that pile. So another way you can represent these cards is by drawing them behind the card, as you would see in a real-life card game. So let's do that. We're going to create a for loop, and we're going to set I equal to the pile counter. And we're going to do it while I is greater than 0, and we're going to decrement I as we go along. Now we want to do this so that the cards are drawn in a way we want them to be. And I'll explain that once I can show it to you. So if the pile at I, and we're going to subtract it by 1, is greater than 0, draw the sprite. Now, I subtracted it by 1 because every time we add a card to the pile, we increment the counter by 1. So the pile counter will always be the number of cards starting from 1 that we have in the pile. But the array starts at 0. So if we have the maximum amount of cards, we need to subtract it by 1 if we're going to use it in the array itself, so that we're not drawing from out of the array. Now, what this is going to do is draw the sprite of the card. So we're going to use the sprite array, and we're going to use the pile at I minus 1 to draw the card, sprite. We want the subimage to be -1, and we want to draw the card at the X position of the card plus 5 pixels for every card we have drawn. And then in the Y position, we want to subtract it by 5 pixels for every card that's been drawn. So let's see what that looks like. But let's remove this token draw we have so that we can no longer see that. So let's drop Squirtle onto the field. Now I'm going to drop a water energy here. As you can see, the card is drawn behind him. Let's drop a double colorless so that we have a little variety. And another one, and another one, and another one. And let's drop Blastoise right here, just so you can see an issue you could have if you decide to go this route that you need to consider. So let's drop as many cards as we can onto Squirtle. So as you can see, this is covering Blastoise. We don't really want that to happen. What you would need to do is we're going to move this selected condition to the bottom. And then if it is selected, we want the depth of the card to be very low, so it will be drawn above everything in the room. And then if it's not selected, we'll set the depth equal to 0. So what that's going to do is when we select a card, it's going to bring it to the topmost layer of the room, and then when we deselect it, it will put it back to the bottommost layer of the room. So let's drop some cards. Drop some cards on Blastoise. So as you can see now, it's no longer being drawn above the card on the field. Now another issue you would have is, so say I select Blastoise and I deselect it. Since it's being drawn at the depth of 0, it's now being put underneath these cards. If you want to not have that happen, instead of setting the depth to 0, you should set it to something specific to where that card is. So what I'm going to do is set the depth to return to the negative field position of the card. So what that will do is it will print each position above the previous position. So what I mean by that is, if I drop Blastoise here, this should be the 0 field position. And if I drop Squirtle here, this will be the 2nd field position. So the Squirtle card will be drawn above the Blastoise. So if I stack Blastoise up, you can see the cards are now going behind the Squirtle. And if I select Blastoise, they're now above the Squirtle. And then if I select Squirtle and let go, it's no longer being put underneath the Blastoise pile. And that will do the same for each card we put down. And since the pile doesn't go in the opposite direction, we don't have to worry about the Squirtle cards encroaching onto the Blastoise. Now, the reason why I want to represent the energy cards as tokens is because if I start stacking the cards here, it will just start to encroach on the other player. So if the other player drops a card over here and adds energy, it's going to start to muck up the field. But if you're creating your own game, you may want the pile look just like we did with the deck here. So I'm now going to revert it to the token method that we did initially. And then I'm going to remove this code up at the top. Now, one way I am still going to use that is I want to draw that pile on the preview of the card. So you know when we select a card, we can see a big version of it in the center of the field. I'm going to add that to the draw function. So what we have is If the card's selected, draw the big sprite in the center of the field. Now what I can do is, for I is equal to the pile counter, and I is greater than 0, and we decrement I as we go along, draw the sprite of the, we're just going to copy this over. And we're going to put the pile number, or the pile card, like we did previously. And then we're going to add a buffer in the X and Y direction, similar to what we did before. But since the card's bigger, we're going to make that buffer bigger. So let's say it's going to be 20 pixels in the X direction and minus 20 pixels in the Y direction. So I'm going to want to add that by 1 because if we get to the 0 position in the card pile, it will draw that card right behind the field card, and we don't want that. So let's see if I did this right. So if I drop this card here, it did draw the sprite, but it didn't change its Y direction. And I think that's because we subtracted I instead of adding I. So let's rerun that. Alright, so now another thing is the energy card is being drawn above the main card, so let's move that behind this. And let's remove the +1 because I believe it's moving more than I want it to. So let's try this again. Perfect. It's being drawn behind the Squirtle. And if I drop another one, and another one, and another one, you can see it's starting to create that pile. Now, there is another problem with this. If we keep adding all the cards we can, and this is something I recommend you do whenever you're testing your game, is to test as much as you can to see if you can make it look unappealing in any way. You see the energy cards are going off of the screen. That's not really how we want it to look. So what we want to do is create a variable view like we did with our hand. You see the hand moves depending on how many cards we have in our hand. We're going to do that for the preview. So in order to do that, we want to make everything a function of I in respects to the pile counter that we're currently drawing. So in our X direction, we're going to subtract 20 pixels for every card we have in the pile. And then we're going to divide that by 2. And then in the Y direction, we're going to add 20 pixels for every card we have in the pile. And we're also going to divide that by 2. And then for the cards in the pile, we want to do the exact same thing. So we're just going to copy that over and paste it here. And then we're going to copy this over and paste it here. So, if we did that correctly, now the cards should be moved for every card we have in the pile. So, let's just stock this up. So, let me show you Blastoise, you can't see the Pokemon or the Pokeball symbol in the background. But you can see that the Blastoise and the Squirtle are in two different positions. Now, if I keep adding cards to Squirtle, you'll see that the card or the cards are beginning to expand. And then if I add all of the possible cards I could possibly really want, or even more than I would ever want, we can see that the cards won't leave the game, or they won't leave the room. So if I put all of the cards, typically you want at least 20 energy cards in your deck and Pokemon, and there's 20 cards on this Squirtle, it lines up perfectly with the room. Now, that's all I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, we're going to learn how to select one of the cards from that pile. In the next video, we're going to cover how to select a specific card in that pile to, let's say, read it, to either read it, remove it, or whatever your game would do. We will want to be able to select one of those cards and do something with it. So if you're interested in seeing that, hit the subscribe button. If this video was at all helpful, hit the like button. Also, if you'd like to consider becoming a patron, there's a link in my description below. I recommend you following my Twitter if you are following the series. And if you have any trouble with any of this, remember to leave a comment below, and I will see you guys in the next one.